UNO's got him, too. Sorry, Midland University. Let's welcome in Brian Munson from Big Red Report. Brian, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How about you guys?
We're doing great, man. Really good. It's
not
Monday.
bad. I mean,
it's better than Monday.
3 cowbells and a negative cowbell for one weekend.
Pretty good.
Yeah. That's something we never really talk about in July. We don't find ourselves talking a lot about recruiting in July, but it's been a different year.
So, I mean, the timing is interesting because it all seems to happen over the 4th of July holiday.
And late at night.
Why do you think that reason is? Is that just the way these kids happen to be wired, or where do you attribute it?
Well, I know with Freedom Akinmaladun that he was waiting to get his whole entire family together to talk it out, and really that was. He told me that the 4th of July was the first opportunity that he was gonna have for that to happen, and also turned out to be his birthday, so it was a significant event in a couple different regards for him. So I know what was kind of wiring him to go ahead and wait to do it until the 4th of July. With Monte Harrison, that's definitely an interesting subject there, because I talked to him probably a week and a half ahead of him committing, and he said basically he hadn't even thought about recruiting, that he was so wrapped up in his baseball schedule and having to train with the time that he did have available for football, that recruiting was totally on the back burner. And he said, yeah, I might take an unofficial visit to Nebraska one of the first weekends, but that would be like the first trip I can make it to Lincoln anytime soon. And I just really kind of felt like you could write this kid off until September, October, and then here we were, a week and a half, 2 weeks after that, talking about him making a commitment to Nebraska, which is an absolutely fantastic get. But here we are, straight right in that Bubba Starling type of fold again, waiting to see where this kid gets drafted at, to see if he potentially signs a professional contract, and how's that going to play out next summer. Is he going to show up for Lincoln and then leave again in August?
Going back to Freedom, looks like he's a pretty good blocker by looking at his tape. How do you think he is in terms of a pass catcher? You think he'll be more of an inline guy to take advantage of his blocking skills, or can he be a guy that can get out wide and catch the ball?
I think he's a little bit more dynamic of a pass catcher than a few guys that are on the team. But I tend to agree with you. This is a guy actually that's played not just as a big blocking tight end for the Grandview offense, but he's also played offensive tackle. So obviously has good feet, is able to go ahead and understands hand placement and what it takes to really set that edge. And I think that's a big thing for Nebraska in this class. I think he has good size, 6'5", 240-ish. 40 times that I've seen on the guy have varied anywhere from that 4.7 range up to the 4.9 range. So I don't know really where he falls at in there, but you watch his film for Grandview, and he's capable of getting behind that second level and also running with some of those third level guys. So that's a good sign. I don't see him as being that true seam guy. I don't think he has Greg Hart's speed. I thought Greg Hart was a very good pass catcher and route runner and had good speed last year in the class. I don't think he's quite to that level. But then again, I don't think he's going to be as limited as some other big tight ends Nebraska's had recently in their offense. So I think he's somewhere in the middle of being able to do that kind of thing with setting the edge, but also being a pass catcher that's working those intermediate routes.
You mentioned Monte Harrison being a baseball player and having to wait for that. I watched his basketball highlights, and I'm a big looking at a guy playing another sport to see how he can do playing football, and that kid is an athlete. I mean, he is. You see his dunks. You see the way he gets off the ground. I understand he's playing football and baseball, but to me, it looks like he could almost play basketball too. Is this one of the better three-sport kind of athlete guys you've seen Nebraska recruit over the last few years?
Well, I mean, go ahead and throw Bubba Starling in there as a three-sport guy too, because his basketball highlights were some of those ones too that people were like, "Wow, this kid's rocking the backboard." And I was told actually from somebody very close to that situation that Bubba Starling would have really set his goals to be a dominant force on the track, that he could have rewrote the record books for high school track. I think definitely he's up there as being one of those top three-sport athletes. He's definitely mentioned to me, with me, in the same breath as Bubba Starling. I don't know how high of a draft pick necessarily that Monte is going to kind of translate to when it comes to, Bubba and his guaranteed money that he was getting where he got drafted at. But I think he's every bit as talented of all-around player on the football field. That kid is. I went from highlight film to highlight film to highlight film when it came to his stuff when he committed, just to kind of refresh my memory about him. He is super talented.
Talking with Brian Munson on the Hardee's Hotline from Big Red Report as we recap what wasn't quite a busy weekend, holiday weekend of recruiting. 3 players in, 1 player leaves. We'll get to that in a moment, but kind of combining now Harrison and you pronounced it Akinmoladun, is that right, or is it Akin?
Dune, right at the end?
Yeah, Akinmoladun is what he says over his voice.
Okay, yep. Okay. Well, either way, they're both from Missouri. A lot of folks consider that now SEC territory, but that's only because Columbia, the University of Missouri, is now in the SEC. But you have so many tentacles in there from non-SEC conferences like Nebraska, Kansas State, Illinois, many others are in there. Is Missouri the state, when you look at it from a recruiting standpoint, in kind of a state of flux right now as to, where it kind of leans to sending its better players towards a certain conference?
I think absolutely. I've always felt like Kansas City was up for grabs every single year, mostly because if you look at Kansas City geographically, it's actually closer to a number of other schools than it is to in-state Missouri. You're looking at Kansas State or Nebraska. It's closer to them than it is to going back to Columbia. Actually, it was interesting timing for these guys to go ahead and pull the trigger to Nebraska, because there was actually a pretty heated article that was released by the St. Louis paper last week that talked about how dismal the Missouri recruiting has been in St. Louis and how up in talent St. Louis was this year. And it was very critical about Gary Pinkel and his staff and the very ineffective job that they've had in St. Louis. And there's still some players in the St. Louis area that they're considered Nebraska. The big one being Brian Wallace, one of the offensive tackles out there, and they had a number of offensive tackles from that area. But none of them, it seemed like Missouri was going to get blanked when it came to those higher profile players coming out of St. Louis actually picking Columbia. They're choosing to go other places.
Then there's Lorenzo Stewart, who, that Klein school district, I moved to Spring in '87, and it was good, but they add schools, they get more and more kids to there now. Looks like Darren Sproles kind of guy out of the backfield catching the ball. I think this really shows what Nebraska's looking for in terms of speed, right? Because 3 or 4 of the last recruits have been guys that are just really fast, possible special teams guys. You see kind of a change in what Nebraska's looking for?
Oh, I think that definitely Nebraska wants teams chasing them all over the field when it comes to their offense. Lorenzo Stewart, the first thing you have to mention about him is his speed. He's a very slight guy, somewhere in the neighborhood of 5'7", 170-ish. But you're talking about a 10-4 guy when it comes to running the 100-meter. So that to me is the first thing about him. I've heard from Josh Harvey, who I work with closely on the side, of course, and from people that are from other people who are making the comparisons, that actually that one guy that kind of draws a comparison to me and to them is Terrell Newby. I know that he's a little bit smaller than what Newby was last year, but let's be honest, we're not talking about 5 inches and 50 pounds. We're talking about 2 inches, 2.5 inches, and 20 pounds. I think that Stewart runs considerably hard for a guy his size, but obviously his money is being made when you get him in space and get him the football, particularly out of that slot position. But I think Nebraska will find many different ways to use both Stewart and Newby when it comes to their speed and trying to get that one-on-one matchup.
Talking with Brian Munson, a Big Red Report, as we recap the recruiting weekend last week. Now, of the players that are in, there are 3, and we've talked about them, but Jason Hall was the one who decommitted. Now, he had already committed without a visit. Considering he didn't visit yet, is there still a chance Nebraska would invite him to Lincoln and try to get a recommit at some point down the road?
I think absolutely. I mean, this is a guy, number one, South Grand Prairie plays good ball in the Dallas Metroplex area. He's a longer guy. I mean, a little bit opposite Mosley, the commitment out of Hendrickson High School. But he's a guy that I think understands the concepts of both, man-to-man protection as well as zone. He's also the kind of guy that can play somewhere in between that, dropping off maybe potentially into a safety spot. But I think this is a guy that Nebraska is going to stay in contact with. Again, I talked to him a week ago. He said he was still salty in Nebraska, but he wasn't going to be thinking about anything for a couple months. And I think that what had just happened was it was just weighing on his head. And he had to go ahead and get out from underneath it now. So Nebraska go ahead and figure out what's going to happen with their situation, as well as trying to continue to recruit him. And he mentioned to us that he was going to continue to stay in contact with Nebraska. I just don't think it's going to be a very good, very likely situation for Nebraska to get him back into the fold, considering who he has offers from now and where he's located at.
What's next, Brian? What's the next guy you see?
Obviously you got T.D. Williams that's announcing his commitment tomorrow from McKinney, Texas. A wide receiver, again, which would be the third wide receiver in the class, which is interesting, but follows that mold that we're talking about. Very fast guy, kind of a slight guy, 5'10", 170-ish kind of guy. And then I think you start shifting your focus maybe finally to the defensive side of the football, which that side of the class seems to be kind of neglected at this point, but it's mostly because the offensive guys have wanted in. And I think we start talking about Peyton Newell at the end of August, which would be a great gift for Nebraska because I think he's as talented a defensive line player, as some of the for being where he's at. I think he's a very talented player. I think he's a two-gap guy, which really has to go ahead and get Coach K and Coach Puchis and Coach Pelini fired up about the guy. I think he's strong enough to actually to do that two-gap.
Brian Munson, Big Red Report, joining us on the Hardee's Hotline. So roughly half the class is full of the scholarships they're expected to hand out during this recruiting cycle. As it stands, Nebraska is still anywhere into the upper 30s, into the 40s in terms of national ratings. As far as making up some of that ground and making it a class more comparable ratings-wise as to the one last year, what do you think they need to do?
Well, I think number one is I think a couple of these guys need to get reevaluated and get evaluated for the first time. I think there's been some assessments that haven't been completely, done accurately enough that you start bringing into consideration 7-on-7 through the summer. You start talking about all these camps, these combines that have been going on, chances for these analysts to go out there and get eyes on these guys one more time before you kind of close it down. So get another evaluation out there before they close it down for the summer and get into the fall season. And I think that Nebraska is got a lot of things in the works. I think there's a lot of players that Nebraska is sitting good with. That I think that when like we brought up Wallace already, we brought up Peyton Newell. I don't think a guy like Jimmy Swain, even though he's kind of eliminated Nebraska, that Nebraska is ever going to completely fade out of that picture. And he would be a tremendous get on the defensive side of the football. And I think you're still looking for, like I said, that one wide receiver. T.D. Williams is a fairly highly rated guy. And then I think Nebraska really needs to focus on that defensive secondary. Losing Hall and the possibility of not getting him back, I think Nebraska needs to go out there and find 2 or 3 more high school cornerbacks, and the more elite, the better when it comes to that position.
Brian Munson, Big Red Report. Brian, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks, guys.